Hey, everybody, and welcome to Managing Security and Compliance in Microsoft Teams. My name is John Gruszczyk. I'm a product manager for Microsoft Teams. I specifically help manage anything security, compliance, or privacy related in Microsoft Teams. Prior to this role, you might know me from our general Microsoft 365 readiness, where I help lead anything Microsoft 365 readiness from training to documentation. And prior to that role, I spent time in our consulting services, working with our enterprise customers on global deployments of anything ranging from Office to Windows, all the way up to Azure migrations. So super excited to get to discuss some of the latest security and compliance features in Microsoft Teams with you today. And we'll hop over to a quick agenda. We're going to start with what's new in Teams security and compliance. Then we're going to hop into the meat of the session today, and that's keeping Teams secure, compliant, and inclusive. And we'll go ahead and compound that with plenty of demos so you can see these configurations in action. So we're going to go ahead and start out with a brief level set of the importance of Microsoft 365. And you'll see this first kind of Microsoft 365 security approach slide. And I won't exhaust anything on here, but it really sets the foundation of the commitments and investment we've made across Microsoft 365 to make sure that Microsoft 365 scales across all of our experiences and platforms. It has the intelligence and automation from AI to help not only IT and admins, but end users be smarter and just rely on that automation. And also, most importantly, or arguably one of the most important areas, is that integration across people, devices, apps, and data. And that's what really ties these 3 points together to make sure that everything under that Microsoft 365 security umbrella is being leveraged by you and your organization. And a double click down from that, as we go ahead and build out this Microsoft 365 integrated security and compliance slide, is that these kind of 6 pillars or areas of protection go across that Microsoft 365 layer. So whether it's identity and access management with items protecting data and employee credentials like multi-factor authentication or conditional access, ranging all the way down to risk management and discover and response, which is more compliance focused. And so again, it's important to be able to leverage these integrated security and compliance features, functionalities across your Microsoft 365 spectrum. And so you'll see as we get into the demos, you don't have to create individual policies or functionalities enabled for one-off applications like Outlook versus Teams. You're able to leverage that whole Microsoft 365 umbrella and integrate across that platform. And so more specifically, on the security and compliance in Microsoft Teams area, we have these 5 pillars that we really stay closely aligned to. And again, I won't exhaust all of these, but one of the most important ones is we safeguard your privacy by design. We have baked this into our services and our solutions. Microsoft believes that privacy is a fundamental human right, and we will continue to design our products and services that way. And without again, exhausting these next 4 bullet points, you're going to see these get brought to fruition in this session. Meetings and video conferencing controls, some abilities to manage identity and accounts and ensuring they stay protected, that protection against any sort of cybersecurity threat ranging from phishing to attempted breaches. And then lastly, but of course not least, is the support for 90+ regulations and internal compliance. Microsoft remains an industry leader in helping organizations be supported with regulations and internal compliance. All right, so now let's go ahead and hop into the what's new in Microsoft Teams. And so some of these items you may be familiar with, and some of them might be relatively new. But we want to kind of quickly cover off a couple of these as we head into the actual demo portion of it. The first is meeting and video conferencing controls. And so some of these areas are broken into lobby and pre-meeting controls. So being able to set the items like a lobby bypass for folks that are part of your internal organization, or also preventing that control from saying, hey, this meeting should not have any anonymous users or someone that's not in our organization until someone from our organization actually joins and kicks that meeting off. And the great thing about lobby and pre-meeting controls are they're not just empowered by IT. You also have passed these down to meeting organizers to be able to specify some of these. And then, of course, meeting organizer tools are extremely important. So once that meeting has kicked off and we have the correct guests and attendees in there, keeping these meetings going on without disruptions, without any sort of, whether they're accidental or purposeful, keeping the meeting on track. So tools like the ability to hard mute everyone in that meeting. Especially helpful for the education space or educators giving lectures. the request to speak. So a little inclusive feature, being able to raise your hand in a meeting and let folks know, hey, you have a point that needs to be talked about, something that in this shift in remote work, we've noticed has been more and more difficult to have everyone included in. And lastly, two other important kind of meeting enforcement controls are the ability to end a meeting completely. So at that point, all meeting attendees would be removed, and also preventing that rejoin. So again, thinking maybe in the educator space or a large lecture, we can actually end that meeting and prevent anyone else from being able to rejoin these. And under those meeting and video conferencing controls, we also have admin policies, which we'll take a look at, the ability to manage scheduling controls, and also a policy package to issue out a common set of policies that apply to certain workers, such as in the education space or first line. Under the information protection space, I'm not going to drain this section because we're actually a little bit deeper in a couple slides. But in general, it is that information protection from both data leakage and also inclusive behaviors in the workplace. And the last area I want to touch on that we won't go deep on in this session is the additional compliance features we are now supporting in Microsoft Teams. So we have native integration with insider risk management to allow you to securely coordinate and collaborate on an insider risk management case. So when a new insider risk management case gets created, a private team is created as well for you to securely collaborate in. And within this, the proper stakeholders get added to that team to be able to manage that case. From an advanced e-discovery support, we now support live documents and links shared in Teams. So if that was shared from, let's say, SharePoint or OneDrive, advanced e-discovery is able to pull that in and collect, review, and export those along with Teams conversations. We also made a very exciting announcement that we will be supporting retention policies for Microsoft Teams meeting recordings. And not just supporting retention policies, but these retention policies will apply wherever the meeting recordings are saved without the need to export these anywhere. And again, as we hop into the information protection area, we're going to understand why it's so important to have these policies travel with that data wherever it goes. You can be on the lookout for these retention policies rolling out in the October timeframe. And then lastly, but certainly not least, as Compliance Manager becomes generally available, we will have some team-specific actions in there to help make sure that your not only Microsoft 365 realm and entire organization are secure and compliant, but within Teams specifically, we have some smart recommendations there. All right, so now let's go ahead and transition into some data loss prevention areas. Starting first with another item that's new is the Microsoft Graph API for Teams data loss prevention. We have two sets of APIs, the first being the Graph API for Teams data loss prevention, which we are happily announcing the general availability of. In short, what this enables developers to do is be able to build applications that can proactively listen to Teams messages in near real time. And in this, they are actually able to then take action, allowing those DLP actions to be applied to Teams messages. The second Graph API that we're excited to announce that is going into public preview is the Graph API for Teams Export. What this API allows you to do is automate and integrate the archiving of Teams messages, and this will also be supporting not just Teams messages, but attachments, emojis, GIFs, or GIFs, depending on your pronunciation, and also the user app mentions. And you'll definitely want to be on the lookout for some more detailed documentation on the Graph APIs, but some quick screenshots here to show that integration. So you can see here the policy incident page, and well, again, this is just a screenshot. You can see the integration of these Graph APIs into our partner solutions. And the last two images we'll take a look at here are both the sender view and the recipient view. So we'll actually even take a look at these from an internal org compliance standpoint. But you see here that sender view is actually going to let the end user know why the message was blocked, and the recipient is going to see that same end user experience as if this was, the team's native data loss prevention policies in action. So there's not going to be a different end user view, whether you're using the Graph APIs or just the native integration of DLP in Microsoft Teams. So again, highly encourage you to go ahead and check out our Dev Center and some of the deep dive sessions on the Graph APIs. Now we're going to take a transition over to privacy controls for meetings and video conferencing. And the real kind of level set of this next couple slides are secure, compliant, and inclusive workplace and how these features and functionalities help drive that. And so from a security control standpoint, I won't drain this slide, but it's what we kind of kicked off the session with. Those meeting and live events policies to help control content sharing and lobby settings so that that meeting kicks off without anonymous attendees or disruptive attendees, and ensuring the correct folks are there. those internal and guest access controls to make sure that we are opening up to secure outside org collaboration, but we have those safety and security protocols in place to make sure that we have that security and compliance layer, even with federated domains or guests in our organization. And then the last kind of areas are those messaging policies to help ensure our internal and regulatory requirements are being met. Those policy packages that we could easily deploy out that have a baseline recommendation of settings to either user groups or department areas. So again, in perhaps the education space or first line workers. And with these policy packages, you can actually edit the policies as well. So it's not like an enforcement. It's a helpful way to deploy out commonly used security policies. And then lastly, with the easily governance area, this is what we'll kind of show in the early part of the demo, is just creating those department-specific policies. We know it's not common that one size fits all for any organization, whether you're 500 users or 500,000. So we really like to support that governance layer, that individual meeting policies based on department unit or even business unit. We're going to shift to the second area of secure access, and that's including endpoint and application management. And application protection is critical to a zero trust strategy or security. And with that shift in remote work and the increase in security and phishing attacks, we really see this zero trust approach become the default. And what that means is not that we're not trusting our security layers or our, even worse, our end users. We're actually just implementing a trust but verify strategy. So what we want to make sure is, for this sake of the session, is that our endpoints and our applications have those security protocols and enforcement in place so that we know those users are who they say they are and that those devices are healthy and apt. And so on this next slide here, you're going to see a nice little diagram of how we protect those access to applications from anywhere using conditional access. If you're not familiar with conditional access, the simplest way to break it down is it is a if-then statement policy. So we're able to process a bunch of signals and define whether that if-then statement flags anything like a high risk, and then how we want to continue on once we've flagged a medium or high risk. And so, for example, we could enforce multi-factor authentication. We could actually block their access, or we can limit it based on what those risk assessments come back by. And then lastly, as we kind of take a look at the flexible endpoints security approach, again, this is leveraging both areas of not only device management, but what we call mobile application management. So from an MDM, or mobile device management strategy standpoint, we're going to have the end user enroll their full device, and we can manage it. In this shift in extreme remote work and that kind of BYOD, or bring your own device scenario, mobile application management becomes extremely helpful because we can actually manage those applications on the device that have corporate data, but nothing else. And so if an issue comes up where I lost my device and I need to have my Contoso organization wipe that device, they're actually not wiping anything like my photos or even my personal Outlook email or personal OneDrive. They're actually only clearing out that corporate data. So you have those flexible approaches to govern how your organization needs. Next area we'll switch over to is information protection. And we're going to kind of quickly take a look at this key customer slide. You might see this in a lot of standard Microsoft pitches. And really the key way to break it down is back to that original slide we kicked off with, is it's built across our platforms. It leverages the AI and automation of Microsoft 365. And then lastly, it's integrated across people, devices, applications, et cetera. To break it down, the easiest way is information protection travels with that data or document wherever it goes. Even if it goes outside of SharePoint or Teams, that protection is remaining with that data, which is critical to the way that we govern security and compliance. And so to get more specifically into the data and information protection in Microsoft Teams, we have three exciting areas. We have sensitivity labels, some native integrated DLP, or data loss prevention, and then communication compliance. And so the first area of sensitivity labels is, you may be familiar with sensitivity labels in documents. What we've now created is the ability to apply a sensitivity label to a Microsoft Teams, SharePoint, or Groups container. And what this does is, when you're creating a brand new team or SharePoint site, you can actually create or apply a sensitivity label so that those protections and policies are automatically applied to anything within that container. From a data loss prevention standpoint, we have the ability to prevent sharing out sensitive information in a channel or a chat session in Microsoft Teams. And we'll see this from an end user view in the live demo. But what this is really about is preventing sensitive data from leaking out of the organization. And it's not just IP or internal information. It also includes things like personal identification numbers or credit cards, things we want to make sure are not getting shared out and helping our organization stay in regulatory compliance. And then the third area to kind of couple that all together is something we call communication compliance. And what communication compliance does is help intelligently identify any sort of communication violation that really just fosters a healthy, inclusive workplace. So communication compliance can actually identify things like sensitive data leaks, but we can also identify violations of harassment or threatening language that really has no place in any sort of workplace. So again, we can use this to help find potential data leak or violations from that sense, keeping data internal. And we can also use it to help find possible just obstructions in the workplace of a culture that we really don't want in the workplace. So now what we're going to shift to is a demo of the sensitivity labels, data loss prevention, communication compliance, and that Teams governance layer. And so this will really kind of wrap up everything that we talked about. And what we really want to see here is just these items in action from the IT admin layer. And then we'll close out that demo with an end user view.
Now that we've had a chance to discuss some key security and compliance items to enable and configure in your organization, let's take a look at some of these items in action. So we're going to focus this demo on 4 key areas. First being the Teams Admin Center controls and policies to help those governance layers. Then we're going to get into the Microsoft Endpoint Manager Admin Center to look at endpoint controls such as multi-factor auth coupled with conditional access. Then we'll get into the compliance area to help govern those data leaks and general information protection. And then we're going to close the demo out with a short end user experience so you can see these protections in action. So the first place we're going to start is that governance layer in the Teams Admin Center. You'll hear me commonly refer to be a governance champion. And this is where it starts. We know that a one-size-fits-all security approach certainly does not fit the large amount of organizations. And this even applies down to things like meeting policies. I frequently get quoted as saying your legal team probably doesn't need to have the same policies as your general organization. And in a lot of cases, we typically look at this as a meeting policy might need to be more restrictive. In this case, I'm actually going to show you our legal team needs to have more open collaboration than the rest of our organization. So it's those governance layers that help us keep our entire organization operating while still having the security and compliance in place. So for example, in my legal team only works with federated and official law firms and partners that we know have been onboarded and are regulated. So I can actually create these to be more collaborative. So audio and video, I want to allow transcription so that everything said in the meeting has been recorded. As far as content sharing, I want participants to be able to give a request control. Same with external participants. So these are both those meeting controls to be able to say, hey, anyone is able to give or request controls. Again, something we want to make sure that our attendees are known before we open these up. But then as we'll hop down to participants and the guests, again, I'm going to actually open these up because we know the folks that will be in these meetings. So as far as automatic admittance, I'm going to allow anyone in my organization or federated organization. Live captions, I'm going to keep it disabled, but the user can override it. And those are just some quick examples of how we can actually create a more open collaboration meeting policy to help that business unit or department be able to conduct those meetings without any issues. Same thing goes with our live events area. You might have the example I have here is an internal versus marketing or external live events policy. An example might be in a marketing event that is one to many, including outside organizers. You might want to make sure that the only person that can record the event is an official meeting organizer. And so, behind that, the idea is no one can actually record something that might be edited or represent something false that might have occurred in the meeting. That way, the meeting organizer can clean up the recording and post it through an official channel. But again, meeting policies and both live events are a great way to be able to create those kind of governance layers to make sure all of your departments, business units, or even user groups are able to have the meetings that they need to have with the open or restricted collaboration. A couple other areas are external and guest access. So external access, again, those governance layers of federated domains, being able to chat and communicate with people outside the organization. Whereas when we get into guest access controls, which is enabled for my Contoso organization, these are actually about bringing guests in your organization, joining your teams. So a lot of times while we have this enabled, we want to offer a lot of the same experience that guests will have as in their native Teams environment. We might want to be a little bit more restrictive based on any sort of internal or external regulatory requirements. So you'll see here the only difference is I actually change, or I turn off deleting sent messages. And then I still want to allow the gifts and funness of Teams, but I'm going to require that my guests have a little bit more strict of a content rating. From a setting perspective, as we hop into here, a common area of governance is files, where end users can be storing things. By default, we have it open, but for example, we have organizations that are very restricted or regulated on where things can be stored. So if you are an organization that can only store in SharePoint, easy enough to turn off all of these features. Or if it's SharePoint plus a third party, again, you can disable everything other than what your organization supports. The last area I'll touch upon is these policy packages. And so I touched upon that in the slide where these are just a great baseline and predefined kind of group of settings that can be applied based on that kind of role type. So for example, if I have first line workers, this policy package has been carefully crafted based on the policies most commonly used. You still do have the ability to edit anything in these policies. But again, a great way to kind of apply baseline level policies and then tinker to them based on your organization. If some of you may have already been working with our policy packages across the security ecosystem or even in the Microsoft 365 apps. Now we want to hop into the next area of endpoint controls. We're going to hop into the Microsoft Endpoint Center. And we're going to not start with app protection, but we're going to go into, we already have Teams as a iOS and app deployed. And so what we want to do is create an endpoint protection on there of multi-factor authentication with conditional access. And what this Teams remote policy will do is I hop into here. Any user in my organization, whether it's the CEO down to my new hired employee just yesterday, is going to get governed by this. So essentially what this policy is doing is if you have Teams, iOS, or Android on your phone, and we deem you a medium or high sign-in risk, you are going to get prompted with multi-factor authentication. So we want to allow the ability to use the Teams app, but we want to have that zero trust approach to make sure the device and end user is who they say they are. So simply, again, we're using an if-then statement to assign a risk to that end user and that device. If we deem them a medium or high sign-in risk, we are going to push a multi-factor authentication prompt or request down to their end user device. And these conditions, I highly encourage you when you're setting up these policies to understand how the risk assessment is formed. But a great overview is, again, if they're using an anonymous browser, Tor, or using a VPN to restrict who they are, or even impossible travel. Let's say within an hour, I logged in North America, Europe, Asia, and Australia, all within an hour. We know that's impossible travel. We are going to flag that as an impossible travel risk, and then again, push that down to the end user. You are not restricted to do this across all end user groups. So you may have end user groups, departments that are need additional policies in place here or additional controls. Again, it gets back to that idea of governance, not a one size fits all approach. This is a great baseline to enforce as a standard zero trust security approach. But again, it's not uncommon to see organizations create 3, 4 of these policies. Now we're going to go into app protection policies. So we have that basic access configured. What we want to hop into is app protection policies. And I have 2 general data leak prevention policies here, but then I've also created what I call my Microsoft Collaboration Apps Protection Policy for iOS. And what this is going to do is govern a common set of applications that my end users are using. That's Outlook, SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams. We know those apps have data, corporate data in there. We know that there's collaboration going on. And so instead of trying to create, individual policies for all of these, we know that my Contoso organization says, hey, these are deemed collaboration apps with corporate data, and they need to have these baseline requirements. And so we can create one easy app protection policy to apply those, requirements on those end users or devices. And so I didn't do anything substantial here from a data protection policy. We still allow copy paste. From an access perspective, pretty basic, requiring a PIN, but nothing crazy here. And as we get into the conditions, we're able to enforce things like if you breach your max pin attempts, if your device has been offline or jailbroken, we can wipe that device, we can block access, etc. And then from an assignment standpoint, again, super easy to assign these out. Right now, I have it just assigned to my engineering group. As we're ready to go to full production, I can remove that and add all of my organization. But again, it's the ability to not create granular level policies based on the individual application if that's not required. In some cases, it is. You might have very sensitive data within applications that you need to create these granular level policies for. But when you don't have to, we highly encourage to not reinvent a wheel, leverage the strength and intelligence of Microsoft 365. So the last area now we're going to go over to is compliance. So supporting that data and information protection. And the first area we'll start with is in the sensitivity label or information protection screen here. You'll see that we already have a Mark 9 confidential policy or information label created that we're going to use in the end user demo. But as I create these test labels, I'll hop here. We can apply any encryption. We can apply content marking. So I'm going to actually add a customized watermark and just call it confidential. Save that. And now once we've actually enabled in our organization the ability to apply sensitivity labels to our SharePoint, Teams, Groups, containers, you will see this additional settings option come up during the wizard. And we're going to go ahead and enable this. And we can control whether it's a public or private group. And then also this really great feature of actually blocking access from unmanaged devices. And that's what I want to do here. So I will fully block unmanaged devices from being able to access. I'm going to close and back that out since we've already had, cancel, as we've already created a policy. The next area we're going to go into is data loss prevention. And this one's going to be pretty simple. We're just going to show the great integration that we have. So I can either create a new policy or I can actually select one of these policies, like my medical protection policy, and edit it. And as we pull open the editing wizard, we're going to advance here to our locations. And you see here that, let's say I created this policy before we even had a Teams rollout in effect. I can now be ready to govern that across Teams chat and channel messages. So again, it's that ability to not have to create a bunch of DLP policies based on all of these locations or services you want to protect. You have it in all in one easy place under that Microsoft 365 umbrella. So again, an example could be we haven't enabled SharePoint yet. We're going to have this off once our SharePoint sites are all stood up and we're ready to actually start, QA and testing. We're going to want to switch that on. Easy enough. You don't have to go and create a bunch of different policies. And we'll back out of that. And again, last area is communication compliance. And so this is helping not only protect against sensitive information leaks, but also against, inclusive behavior or encouraging inclusive behavior. So I have 3 custom policies here. The first being Mark 9 is going to protect against sensitive data leaks. I have a Contoso HR policy that's going to protect against offensive, threatening, or harassing language. And then I also created a third custom dictionary policy. Essentially, my Contoso HR department has gotten together and said, hey, we believe these words are not inclusive or should be used in the workplace. So I actually added custom words in there. And if we take a quick look at the Mark 9 policy, again, same area of locations. We're able to support Exchange, Teams, and Yammer to have that flow through. So I'm going to cancel this out, and we're actually going to switch to my Teams client here. And so I'll switch into the first of data loss prevention. And so you'll see here that I was interested in getting some lunch with Alex, and I sent to him my credit card number. And this message was immediately blocked by one of the financial DLP policies in place. And you'll see here, it gets blocked, and it doesn't just block the message, it actually instructs the end user why it was blocked. And this is extremely important because we don't want to just block a message and have the end user raising tickets or calls to help desk. We want to encourage them to understand why it was blocked. So here, clear understanding, it was credit card. Here's what you're able to do if you'd like to report it and escalate it up in the case of if you believe a false positive. But again, it's critical to be able to inform the end user because in some cases, if it's communication compliance related, where it's harassing language, we of course want them to know that it's not acceptable. But sometimes end users won't quite understand why sharing a credit card number or a piece of personal information might not be great for the organization due to regulatory or compliance standards. So again, it's really about educating those end users on why this wasn't, a great message to send or should be sent at all. And you're going to have the same, a very similar end user experience if this was offensive or threatening language. And so the last area that we want to show from an end user perspective is we hop over here to my teams, is we're going to create a team using that Mark 9 project label. So I'm going to go ahead and click join or create a new team. I'm going to select create a team here, and I'm going to build it from scratch. And you'll see this menu of being able to select Mark 9 confidential. And you'll see if I'm using this Mark 9 confidential label, I can only create a private team. As soon as I were to change that, let's say my project Falcon, I have different abilities, and that's all based on that wizard as we are creating. So I'm going to go ahead and select Mark 9 confidential, private, and we'd be able to create that team as is. So again, it's extremely important as we went through these kind of demos to understand that it's not about creating all these granular level policies for each individual service and application. Some cases it is required for you as an organization to do that, but many times we can kind of use those Microsoft 365 enterprise-wide settings to leverage the strength, the intelligence to know that whether a document or data goes through Teams, to Exchange, to SharePoint, we have those data protections roaming with it. Wherever it goes, we have those safe and inclusive communication compliance items in effect. So we're really fostering that safe, inclusive, compliant workplace. So now we're going to go ahead and close out the session and hop back into a couple last slide pieces.
And now that we got to see some of those items in action, the last thing that I'll leave you with, and I'm very excited to share and announce, is the announcement of Customer Key being supported in Microsoft Teams. One of the top level questions we are constantly getting asked about, not just at Microsoft, but across the industry, is how can we meet compliance obligations without compromising on data security? And one of those areas comes through something that we call Customer Key. And so just a reminder, Microsoft Teams data and all Microsoft data is kept safe by encrypting it in transit and at rest in our Microsoft data centers. But what Microsoft 365 does is it allows an additional encryption layer at the application level that we call service encryption. And what Customer Key is it's built on that service encryption layer, and it enables you as the customer to provide and control your own encryption keys. And this enables customers to meet additional regulatory or compliance obligations for controlling those root keys. Customer Key is something that actually currently exists today in SharePoint Online, OneDrive for Business, and Exchange. And so for those of you customers that are already taking advantage of this, you will be extremely excited to know that this Customer Key support will be extended out to Microsoft Teams. We will not be doing a deep dive on the architecture layers of Customer Key specifically in Microsoft Teams, but I highly encourage you to be on our tech community, be on the lookout for some new updates in the blogs, but you can expect to see some more information on Customer Key in Microsoft Teams as we start to close out the calendar year, so towards December of 2020. And for some more information and detailed deep dives into some of the items we talk about today, I highly encourage you to check out some of these other related and relevant sessions. So whether it was the security and compliance side or safe and inclusive meetings, we have a lot of great content that you can check out and get a little bit more deeper into some of the items we talked about. So again, highly encourage you to take a look at some of these sessions and view them. All right, and to close out the session, I'm going to leave you with 3 important points that I feel are what we most discuss here at Microsoft in the team space. First, educate and empower the organization. And this means a lot of the features that we talked about from the end user view. Make sure your end users know how to not only use these, but the importance of them. As we looked at the data loss prevention policies and communication flags, just understanding why those are so important to the organization, and also, encouraging the use of things like, making sure that only the meeting organizer can record the meeting, et cetera. We find that education is extremely, extremely important in organizations. The next layer of that is kind of going off that is be a governance champion. And you hear me talk about this a lot, no matter what I'm talking about, whether it's Teams or Microsoft 365 all up. But it goes back to that demo of creating those layers of governance. We know that a one-size-fits-all approach is not very successful in most large or even smaller organizations. So make sure you're taking advantage of those governance layers and enabling full open collaboration when you can. And if you need to be more restrictive in certain departments or business units, feeling empowered to create those governance layers to go off without a hitch. And then lastly, it's just leverage Microsoft 365. Take advantage of that strength and intelligence that we've built into that Microsoft 365 ecosystem, whether it's security features like conditional access coupled with multi-factor authentication, or it's that retention, compliance and retention and policies with e-discovery. Just leveraging the automation and that power of Microsoft 365 is really how you get that full integration across the suite, across the ecosystem, across your organization. So I'll leave you with those three, and thank you for joining us for this session, and really look forward to getting to talk with everyone on the tech community, and hope you have a great day or evening wherever you're joining us from. Thank you again.